the therapeutic idea that led to, that I proposed with somebody back in '85 was that if you can take that memory, that traumatic memory that is a fragment, free floating fragment, that basically can cause all kinds of havoc, if you can
Right.
take it and in a therapeutic setting, attach it to a context. It could even be the therapeutic context, doesn't matter. Just anchor it in some context so that going forward, the next time you think about it, you won't think it's happening right now. It won't be quite as scary as it is.
You know today's guest, but unless you're a post-grad psychology student, you just don't know that you know today's guest. He has changed the life of your neurologist, your psychologist, your therapist, and your local college's psychology department. And if you've ever heard smart people talking about what they've learned from the brains of mice, a lot of times they're talking about Dr. Lynn Nadel. It's almost not hyperbole to say that if there is an award for studying the brain, he's won it. Perhaps most notably, he co-authored the book called Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map, which forever reshaped the cognitive neuroscience of memory and spatial navigation. So if you've ever wondered what it would be like to hear a world-class psychologist discuss free will and trauma responses with a mediocre piano teacher from Iowa, today's your lucky day. If you've read my story, you know that neurologist Oliver Sacks played a huge role in turning my life upside down and disabusing me of many of my extremist evangelical fundamentals. It's been a weird path, but it led me here, so I can't complain. What you might complain about is the Zoom audio, and I'm with you. I normally wouldn't allow it, but the other platform wasn't cooperating, and the content in the interview was worth it. The one little thing that you'll need to know going in is that the part of your brain called the hippocampus is most famous for playing a key role in memory. It's called the hippocampus because that's the Greek word for seahorse, and it kind of looks like a seahorse. Now, as always, I hope that I've brought you someone that you don't fully agree with, but he brought himself, and he hasn't always fully agreed with himself. That's part of what I love about people like him. It's all about collaborating to discover truth, even when that costs us our preconceptions and deeply held beliefs. This all connects to my upcoming video on free will, empathy, and psychopaths, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that. But I'll shut up now and let you enjoy a superhero of psychology, the great Dr. Lynn Nadel. What exactly is a memory?
Oh.
Just an easy question like that.
That's a simple question that is extremely difficult to answer, in a meaningful way. Memory. Okay. Memory. Let's not start by trying to define a memory, but just memory. All right, because
Okay.
right. So memory is some residue in our brain that is the result of prior experience. It simply is whatever we have learned. It's the result of learning. All right?
Right.
That's what memory is in general. There are many kinds of memory. When you say what is a memory, typical what the sort of person in the street would think of, and when you say that is, you know, what is what is a memory in the sense of what makes up my memory for what I did yesterday or some experience I had last week, or they don't think about muscle memory,
Right.
the way our muscles learn to do things. They don't think about emotional memory necessarily. They don't think about, I mean, what people typically think is what we call episodic memory or autobiographical memory. That's a memory. Now, what is that kind of a memory? That's a very special kind of memory because it captures, specific features of your experience, not just move your muscle this way to ride a bike, which you really can't talk about, but you do, right?
Right.
But an episodic or autobiographical memory includes information about what happened and where it happened and to some extent when it happened and why it happened and with whom it happened and all kinds of details, that make it into the rich fabric of what we say, do you remember when we did something or other like
Right.
that? So that's the more complex answer. And that's the kind of memory that most people are interested in and think about. But it is not the only kind of memory. In fact, it's just one sort. Okay.
Right. Okay. So then let me backtrack a little bit here. You said something about muscle memory, and as a pianist, of course, this is very important to me.
Uh-huh.
Is my personal view is
Yeah.
that that's not a real thing, that your muscles aren't learning, but then you use the phrase muscles learning. I don't know if you're speaking analogously about this or if that's a view.
Good catch. Obviously the muscles aren't learning, but the way in which we use those muscles, and in combination with other things, and the sequences of muscular movements we put together, those are memories. They're not in the muscles, but they are in the neurons controlling the muscles, right?
Right.
So somehow, there's a memory for, in the motor system for move this, then move that, then move that, then do this. And I mean, all of that is not verbalized, of course, but there's sequence of instructions for how to move muscles. So that's what I mean by muscle memory. It's a memory for how to do, how to act, how to use your body and all of its parts to accomplish something. That's loosely referred to as muscle memory, but it's actually a bad phrase in some ways.
Right. So, like so many of the phrases I run into, it seems like it is a great phrase as an analogy. The experience of it is that your muscles are remembering,
Yeah.
but what's actually happening is something entirely different. So,
Right. Well,
from
having said that, sorry to interrupt.
no,
Ha-
go.
Having said that, it's probably the case that that in fact it almost certainly is the case that the synapses, between the neurons and the muscles, probably are also plastic, and it becomes easier to make certain movements, over time. So there is something kind of like muscle memory. There may be. I mean, actually, I'm not an expert in this. That's the
Right.
interest. That's the interesting is well, interesting or not, I know very little about this kind of memory.
I love this. He's one of the greatest minds on the hippocampus and memory, and yet he says, I know very little about this kind of memory. The smartest people I know say, I don't know most often. Now, it's my current hypothesis that rich, famous, and powerful people tend to overestimate their expertise. They may have gotten lucky in the housing market, or received an inheritance, or been elected to a position, and they become blind to their own ignorance because it just feels so obviously true that they are important and that their opinion matters. But for people who have earned their expertise through persistently updating their understanding across repeated failures, they seem acutely aware of the boundaries of their knowledge and overly cautious about overstepping or overstating their certainty, which is why I feel intellectually safer around those people who say, I could be wrong, but here's what I think and here's why.
I'm not the right person to talk to about the motor system. But my guess is, there may even be plastic changes at the synapses, that connect the nervous, neurons that are controlling the muscles. They may, chances are that there are plastic changes at those synapses that make it easier, to use certain pathways of that sort. Again, I'm
Right.
not the expert.
And so, well, okay. So then, I'm even less the expert. So I'm gonna go ahead and ask you anyway. So I've heard then that you have neurons throughout your body, especially in the gut.
Sure, sure.
As far as making memories, is it possible that some of the remembering is happening outside of the hippocampus or wherever the long-term memory is stored?
I think yes. The short answer is yes, because we keep on learning things that we wouldn't have imagined, would have been the case. So the gut biome is a good example. There's obviously plenty of communication between the gut and between the heart and between all the various organs in the body are communicating with the brain, letting the brain know what they're doing, you might say, and the
Right.
brain is interrogating them to find out what's going on, all the time. So could some of those circuitries involve what we're loosely calling memory in the broader sense of the term, a residue of experience? Sure. I mean, from
Yeah.
that point of view, the immune system shows memory, right?
Right.
So
Yes.
yeah, I mean, so this general idea that what changes as a function of experience, that deserves the word memory, in the broadest sense of the term, pretty much everything. The thing is, most people are not interested in those kinds of memory. That's not what they think about, as we started out saying.
Well, they're not
Anyway,
they're not interested in it because they don't recognize its significance to their experience because it
I
doesn't
think
feel
that's
like
fair enough. And I think, yeah, as it becomes more clear that something like memory, that you can train your gut, or you can train your muscles, or I mean, that's, creating memories, but we don't call those memories, but that's what they are. Yeah, as that becomes better understood, you're absolutely right. I mean, that people will begin to to know that they in some sense have some control over those things, or the possibility of control, which they maybe
Right.
thought they didn't have. So it would be useful. But again, all the terminology around memory is completely contaminated, by the everyday baggage of the word, that goes back to the thousands of years. I mean, everybody knows what memory is, right? Except
Of
nobody
course.
does.
Right. Yes. Well, and once again, like the experience, everyone does know what the experience of memory is. But so few people, I think about what it is, or experience the disjointedness of the experience versus the actual neurology or psychology of it. That it feels like anyone who's explaining this part over here obviously doesn't know what they're talking about, because this experience over here is so obvious and so intuitive. Um,
And that's a real problem. And that's a problem in general for most things that psychologists or neuroscientists, cognitive neuroscientists study, is that, we all have our own experiences and knowledge, so to speak, based on our experiences of what all these things are. And so the words, become really difficult, to define in a scientific way, so that they kind of can be free of the baggage from all this common day usage. Same emotion, memory, all these words, that we bandy about as psychologists. Everybody in the world experiences those things, so they all have their naive theories about, how those things work. And, sometimes they're right, interestingly enough, but most of the time it's underneath the hood. You ask somebody about, what is it that makes a car go? I mean, to somebody who doesn't know anything about cars, it's magic,
right.
right?
Well,
There's
yeah, it has to do with the key. The key is
you
obviously the
turn the
most
key
important
and
part
the
of the
car
car.
goes. I mean, there's
Yeah.
something going on there, depending on whether it's an EV or not, but I haven't got a clue what's going on there. Basically, I turn the key and, I put my foot on the accelerator and the car moves. Wow, that's pretty cool. And that's
Right.
it, right? And I think it's the same with this, with sort of mental phenomena are the same. They just
Yes.
happen. We really don't understand it. As non-scientists, we don't have a good understanding at all of what's going on under the hood, in those things. Sometimes
Right.
it matters and sometimes it doesn't.
Well, and I think too that it's so counterintuitive and disruptive and disorienting to learn what is actually going on, that if you learn more about a car, you just know more about a car. If you learn more about your brain, you know less about yourself.
Totally
And
correct.
it's
Yeah, the biggest example of that is not with regard to memory. I'd say the most interesting or point, important example of that is the issue of free will. I mean, the big debates about, is there such a thing as free will? If you really get down to it, it's all, and I think if you push most scientists hard on this one, they're going to end up saying, well, yeah, I mean, it's all pretty deterministic, basically. There's, it's, if we could basically track, every single neuron, we would know exactly what you're going to do.
this point here. This general idea was a major player in my own deconstruction. Not the general free will part. We argue that to death, even in the church. Like, if God hardened Pharaoh's heart, then who's really responsible for Pharaoh's actions? Look, if God's omnipotent, he gets to do whatever he wants to do. But what got me was Oliver Sacks's straightforward accounts of people with brain injuries. I started to realize that the phrase, if I were you, was ridiculous. If I were you, I would be you, and I would think what you think, and I would do what you do. Maybe there's some room in there for free will and self-determination. But I'm not like this because I'm superior. I'm like this because I'm me. And what's more, in the same way that those people can't see that they're wrong, maybe it's hard for me to see the places I'm wrong too.
Of course, that's not plausible, since there are 90 billion of them. But the point is, most scientists would end up wishing to defend a deterministic perspective on this, which ultimately seems to mean that we don't have free will, right? Except that most of the philosophers who talk about this, have found arguments for why that fact doesn't matter. That actually, practically speaking, we have free will. We have no idea about the stuff going on under the hood. So we are making real decisions in real time. And, whether they're determined or not at some micro level is kind of beside the point. But anyway, that's where this issue really is sort of most most fevered in the literatures around the issue of free will. Consciousness is, again, what is that? There's no lack of thorny problems, basically. That's why
Sure.
the hippocampus is attractive, because it's concrete. It's
Okay.
actually there.
Okay, I didn't expect that sentence, but yes, I mean, given how abstract this is for most people, to say that
Some of the
something
some of the
concrete.
major figures in the hippocampus world basically say, "Don't even say the word consciousness to me. I'll smack you upside the head if you even utter the word." So they just
Right.
don't want to get into any of that kind of stuff, basically. But
Yes.
some
Right.
some don't. O'Keefe wanted to. O'Keefe has written. He wrote a chapter on consciousness back in, I think it was '95, in a book. I mean, I don't think he's right about it, by the way, but nonetheless, he's somebody who's willing to talk about consciousness.
Right.
Bruce McNaughton, who's another major figure in the hippocampus world, he's a close friend and former colleague here at Arizona. He's of the sort who says, "Don't even say that word in my presence," kind of thing.
Right. So then my question is that because the personality of people who tend to get into studying the hippocampus are just not interested in that, or is
No,
they have very strong opinions about it, but they would just rather not discuss that because it draws away from.
presumably. No, I don't think it's got anything to do with hippocampus. I think you'll find the same split. Most of the people who work, in cognitive neuroscience, not kind of cellular molecular neuroscience, where they really don't get into it at all, unless they're, like Roger Penrose and what's his name, the people talk about exoskeleton kind of implications, theories of, at that level, quantum consciousness. Mostly people just avoid it. But there are people who,
Yeah.
depends. It's a personal thing. It's got nothing to do with the hippocampus. Although the
Yeah.
hippocampus, given its particular position in the hierarchy and the kind of information processing that goes on there, is frequently linked to consciousness, because we tend to be conscious of the things that the hippocampus is processing.
Okay.
The question is whether we have to be. In fact, it's not real clear yet whether that's not been clarified. There's a long debate in the field about whether consciousness came into play in eye blink conditioning, when it involved the hippocampus. In human eye blink conditioning, there's Larry Squire and a bunch of others went off on a tangent for 10 or 15 years arguing about whether consciousness was critical to the hippocampus and hippocampal involvement in eye blink conditioning or not. There are some forms of eye blink conditioning that do actually require the hippocampus. Not all of them, but depends on the Pavlovian, arrangement, timing, and things like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but this is a sidetrack.
Yeah. Well, and
Consciousness is a sidetrack.
right. Yes, and it easily pulls me in. It's a fascinating topic, but
Me too, unfortunately.
to get back to the hippocampus, as I understand it, and I probably don't, so please jump in and correct me here. The hippocampus deals primarily with memories and mapping.
Well,
And
that's what we think. Yes,
okay,
most people would agree that it's the question. Most people would agree with that. Yes, it
okay,
seems to play some critical role in some forms of memory and in spatial mapping or spatial cognition.
okay. Stick with me for just a second. You're going to wish that you knew this. We've known that the hippocampus was vital in forming memories. So, hippocampus memories, hippocampus memories. But a researcher named O'Keefe found that some cells on the hippocampus would fire when subjects would cross over a certain place, making it seem that that place was very important to the subject, which is why those cells got named place cells. Well, then, everyone wants to know, what's the hippocampus, the memory thing, doing trying to track locations? But this conundrum was only made worse when another researcher named Moser found that other cells were firing not in just a specific location, but seemed to be laying out a grid, presumably so that the subjects could have an entire grid of their surroundings. This is why those cells are called grid cells. It should be noted that they didn't come up with the idea of a brain map. The link between mapping and memory in the hippocampus was the revolutionary work of one Dr. Lynn Nadel, the guy in this week's episode. And he did it 30 years before the discovery of grid cells. At least that's how I understand it, but I don't understand it. You should read and listen to smart people, not me. But as always, in case my ignorance is currently better than your ignorance, you're free to use it as a stepladder to reach for truth. Now back to a smart person.
Yeah.
Right. Specifically spatial, or is it relational and emotional too?
Well, that's the debate. That debate's been going on for 15, 20, 30 years. I would say that up until the Mosers discovered grid cells, and then subsequently the Nobel Prize that they shared with O'Keefe, I would say that the relational idea was winning the debate in the field until then.
Yeah.
That changed things. That made it clear that this system, that space played some privileged role in this system. Now you still have arguments about whether, okay, there's this privileged role for space, but maybe because in order to do spatial mapping, you have to have a relational system. Maybe it basically ends up being a general relational memory system, that is capable of putting any things together, not just spatial things, but social things or emotional and so on. That debate continues in some ways, but I think the sort of unique and important and always present role of space when you talk about hippocampus. So the Mosers, for example, others have said, look, hippocampus is involved in other things, in mapping emotions or in mapping social spaces or whatever, but all of that always rides on a spatial sort of framework. That the space is always there. These other things may be there, may not be there. So it becomes a kind of a philosophical debate about, how do you think about this system? Is it a special purpose system? Is it a general purpose system? Did it start out evolutionarily as a special purpose system, but got co-opted because it was so useful, because the computations you needed to do to create a spatial map ended up being so powerful and useful that other systems kind of grabbed onto it, so to speak. So now you can use it to map other kinds of things that aren't spatial. These are kind of open questions which are really hard to answer because we don't know the evolutionary history. I think one could argue quite strongly that this thing started out as a spatial system. That seems clear. I think the data on that are pretty clear now because it goes back 350 million years, and you can track it. It's remarkably preserved across a wide range of species. But the question of, has it been adapted to other things and so on, so that by the time you get to humans, it really is a general relational system.
Yes.
That's a debate which I fear will not be settled in my lifetime, if ever, because it's almost a matter of taste.
I guess I need more context in order to understand the debate, because it seems intuitive to me that a spatial map is the same thing as a relational map. If I've got the resources to dedicate to a more robust map, eventually it's going to turn into memories and then relationships and community tracking and eventually then language as I try to share my map with other people.
Interesting you put it that way, because actually somewhere in the 78 book, the sentence is there which says that language may have evolved so that people could share their maps with other people. Literally that idea. That's got to be wrong, by the way, but
oh man, I want it to be right.
It's too simple. It's too simple. Language evolved for lots of reasons, but sharing information, right? A lot of which is mapped in, like, hey, here's where I found that, a rich source of animals that we can hunt, and that sharing that kind of information clearly is important. But there's a lot more going on with language than just the sharing of sort of spatial and map-like information.
So then let me give you my thought on it so you can fix that. So when I say language, I don't mean like broadly language, but I mean definitions of ideas. So if I want to share an idea with you, if I want to tell you what a platypus is, let's say, I have to start with things that already exist and try to combine them for you. Well, it's like it's got a duck bill, and it's got it lays eggs, and so it is like a thing plus another thing, and that is, then I put a word to it. So obviously, like, there are species that communicate with other species that don't have a hippocampus, and they're using language. Let's say, maybe that's not fair to say. But
Yeah.
the human
Yeah.
language is the like, well, here is a communication plus another communication, and those together are going to create some new idea that I'm trying to give to you.
Sure, that's all fine, but none of that actually seems to require, spatial or cognitive maps in any simple sense. I mean, what you're talking about is that pretty much everything is about relations. I mean,
Right.
everything, all of our mental apparatus is, it's always about relations. What goes with what, right? And
Right.
we build up, vast stores of categorical knowledge about, what does it mean to be, a platypus, which of course is a very unusual member of whatever category it's in. It's an outlier. It's an interesting outlier. Have you ever seen one in live?
I have not. Where would
Yeah.
I see one? I don't even know where they are.
Well, they're in Australia, and I was when I was there, 10, 15 years ago, one particular time I was there, we spent maybe an hour and a half sitting at a platypus, like these duck blinds that they have when you're a duck hunter.
Right.
There's a somewhere up in the Daintree Forest, well north in Queensland, near where the reefs are on the northeast part of Australia. There's a place called the Daintree Forest, gorgeous, fantastic forest, and there's a place where there's a platypus blind where you can go sit there behind something, and there's a water pond like thing where supposedly every so often platypi kind of show up. We sat there for like an hour and a half and saw nothing, but
Oh,
you can see them in the zoos there. I mean,
okay.
so
Yeah.
that's where they exist basically. Yeah,
Right.
and they're kind of cool. They are kind of cool.
That's really cool. To go back to the map thing, I've got this fundamental question about the word map because an actual map is an analogy. It's your house is to the park as this dot is to this dot. Um,
Mhm.
and so, but when we say that the mind is mapping, that's an analogy to a map, which is an analogy. And so then the question for me about like what is actually taking place here is there another analogy that you like, or um, is there?
No, I think the reason we settled on the map analogy, not it was partly because Tolman had already been there and said, this idea about a cognitive map, but also because, we thought that this system, it, although it wasn't going to generate like something that would look like a map if you could slice the brain,
Right.
oh, there's a map there. No, this system generates a representation that has the properties of a map. So when you think about a map, it's just a generic map, and I mean not one of these maps of economic activity or populations, but just an actual map, a map of the physical layout of a space. Uh, then that map contains just the map itself. I mean, who like Google Maps, but like these, you may be too
Right.
old to remember it, but people used to go around the world with paper maps.
Right. Yes.
What road are we on? You can't
Yes.
consult Google Maps. You just got a book full of maps. And the gas stations used to give them out, right? So, so these maps contain information, and it's of the sort you just described. It is basically this city stands in this relationship to that city, and so on. And from the map, you can figure out how to get from one point to another, where they are with and quite frequently some big landmarks, like there's some mountains over here and so on. So what we thought was that's the kind of representation that we're talking about. It somehow contains that kind of information, and because of that, it conveys to the organism that has it certain capabilities, namely how to get
Right.
around in the world and to understand, it's where it is and how to get somewhere, and where other things are that it might want, and where are their safe places, all that kind of stuff. Basically,
Right.
the map metaphor, it is a metaphor. You're right, but it's meant to suggest that this representation has those properties and basically conveys those capabilities. Just like a map allows you to figure out how to get from A to B, this thing allows you to figure that out too.
Right. And so the more high resolution the map, the more information you have about the resources and things and
Yeah, I mean, there are maps, of course. You could take that map and then you can sort of say, okay, here's where the restaurants are. All right.
Right.
So if you're a rat, the restaurants are the places where, the experimenter gives you the food, right?
Right.
Yeah. So maps can be, but just a pure topographical map, right? Go
Okay.
back, if you're a hiker, or you've been out and you get these topo maps, which they don't tell you anything other than the landforms and the out, the lines tell you where there's elevation changes. That's it, right? A
Right.
pure topographical map is stripped of all of that other stuff. And we
Yeah.
think that that's where the system starts. It starts out just a system of spatial locations and their relation to each other. That's what the hippocampus provides as like a backbone. The wiring of the hippocampus creates that backbone. Then your experience allows you to put in the content. Here's the restaurant, and here's a gas station, and here's
Right.
so on. You fill in, and by filling them in the places where they exist, you automatically create knowledge about the relationship between the restaurant and the gas station. Just by, even though you may have experienced those on totally different occasions, and you've never gone from one to the other. If you've
Right.
got them in the same map, you can say, oh, yeah, there's a restaurant here that I like to go to, gas station over here. I can go directly to the gas station, that kind of thing.
Right.
So the map that we have allows you to do that, right? And our assumption is that the hippocampus provides like the scaffold or the framework, which is the spatial framework. It's hardwired into the system as a kind of a spatial matrix to which you then attach the things that happen in the world. And
Okay.
and as you're attaching those things, you're creating an episode memory, right? If
Right.
you delimit it by time, then at this particular time, this was the distribution of things in the world that I happened to experience, and so on. So that's why it became so connected to episodic memory, because it
Right.
because it provided the basis for putting together all the bits and pieces. And the only thing that's missing there is the sequence, is of how it plays out over time. And that turns out to be complicated because episodes play out over time. So
Right.
so there's in any given episode, there's like fixed elements. There's the background stuff that doesn't change, the room you're
Right.
in, the city you're in, whatever. But then there's all the stuff that's all the pieces that are moving, usually involving animate, if it's weather, there could be stuff happening that, isn't animate, but mostly it involves people and other animate beings moving around, and stuff happen, and objects move, and things fall from trees and all kinds of stuff. So a lot of the work in the last few decades has been to try to figure out how to add this sort of sequential information, the episodicity. I'm not even sure that's a
Right.
word, but anyway,
Okay.
sort of the episodiness of the memory, because it happens over time, right?
Right.
That's a lot of the work more recently has been about trying to nail that down. Because we now know that's the case, that the hippocampus is storing sequences, not just sort of a static map, but a static map with sequences kind of layered on top of it in some way.
Right. Yeah. A map of time and a map of space.
Yeah. Well, it's a map of space as the space is changing over time. It's not really a map of time in quite the same in the there are
Yeah.
the issue of the temporal part of the equation has been very vexed over the last 20 or 30 years, and it was made more complicated by the discovery of the so-called time cells in the hippocampus. That was a poor choice of words. They're not time cells. They're not keeping track of time. They are sequence cells. They're firing at a particular point in a sequence. They're not keeping track of absolute time, but they are temporal in some sense of that phrase. But it's
Right.
different than the way space. The thing is really spatial, and it has this layer of dynamics. Um,
Yes.
but others would argue, of course, I'm telling you what I think. Others would argue that no, time is actually the most important dimension. This is not.
Well,
I don't think this is true. Actually, I will send you, if you wish. Let me show
yeah.
you. Hold on. So this, if you can see it, if it's not blurred.
It's there's a tree on it. Oh yeah.
Okay, see this book, Space, Time,
Yes.
and Memory.
Yes.
This was a conference that we held here in Arizona two years ago, and there's a bunch of, it's Oxford University Press, And there's a
Yes.
bunch of chapters in here, including one by me and a philosopher on whether space or time is the fundamental organizing principle for memory. So
I'm quite sure I've read that. Yes.
so you've seen this. This
Yes.
is Sarah Aronowitz was the other
Uh-huh.
author. Oh, good. So you,
Yes.
okay,
Yeah,
well,
yeah. It's great. Thank you.
you're on top of this already. So, but I want to hear something about you know about you. I mean, where's all this coming from? Are you really a former pastor? I mean, come on.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so I shared a little bit with you that
Yeah,
impact of Oliver Sacks on me and stuff, and
yeah. He had an
you know,
impact on everybody, pretty
yeah,
much.
right, right. Anyone who paid attention, for sure. And so the study of the brain had a lot to do with my own personal deconstruction over about a decade. And then, like I said, I have this friend too who had his left hippocampus removed for his epilepsy, and well, almost all of it, virtually all of it.
Yeah,
I've seen the MRI. It's like you can see the right side, and then the left side is just basically nothing.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and he recently had he had an RNS that was going perpendicular to it. They pulled that out and put it in parallel with it, and it has significantly uh, improved his life because of the recovery time. He's still having seizures at the same rate that he was before, but it would take a week to recover before, and now it's a matter of hours. And so
Hmm,
his life is drastically different at this point. Um,
great.
and it's interesting to me that, for example, like his memory, because he's also taking piano lessons, and his progress in piano has been so much greater. And before he would have said, well, it's because of my epilepsy, I'm not able to remember, and I don't have half of my one of my hippocampi.
Yeah,
And so, for him, that was the experience is I can't learn. But now that his recovery time is faster, he's able to learn much faster. And so that's interesting to me, and all the ways of the way that we tell stories to ourselves.
sure.
And if we forget something, well, depending on your age and how afraid you are of losing your memory, you might say, well, I'm not remembering things because I'm older, and it might just be because you're not remembering things. But the stories that we tell ourselves impact the way that we progress through the world and
Sure.
develop as people. So anyway, that would be a big ball of stuff that I'm interested in and the reasons that I'm interested in them. So yeah, it's just always been fascinating to me. Um, so
So you make podcasts? That's what this.
I'm starting a podcast. This is a really great excuse for me to ask people to have conversations with me that I wouldn't qualify for otherwise. So yes,
Have you had much success getting people to do this?
I have. Yes, it's been. I mean, you are at the top of the list. I'm also having a conversation with tomorrow morning. I'm talking with the Daryl Davis. I don't know if you've heard of him before. He's a black guy that goes to KKK meetings, and he talks to these guys, befriends these guys, and they
Yeah.
leave the KKK and give him their KKK robes. So he's got a
Oh,
closet
I
full.
think I've read about this guy. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So just people like that, where it's like, the general population hasn't necessarily heard of them, but they're some of the most fascinating people on Earth, and I get to talk to you.
Well,
So yeah, it's been wildly successful, so much so that if nothing else became of it, and I had to shut it down today, it's been worth all the work. I mean, I'm getting to talk to
yeah.
you about the brain as a piano teacher from Sacramento. That shouldn't happen, but I appreciate your time very much.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's pretty cool. So you're now a piano teacher.
Yeah, I've been a piano teacher since I was 13, and I was a worship pastor during 20 years of that. I was a school teacher on and off throughout there,
You don't
and
look old enough to have done all of
that's sweet. I'm gonna put that at the beginning of the podcast.
that. Yeah, but yeah, yeah, fair enough. Okay, so that's your
Yeah.
background, and your interests go beyond the brain, obviously. I mean, you're just interested in interviewing people you think might be interesting. Now,
Yes.
who's going to want to watch this?
Anyone who enjoys interesting things,
But how do you?
I would.
Sure, no, fair enough. But but how do people who might plausibly be interested in watching it? How do they become aware of the existence of it? I mean, how do you make how do
Yes.
you find your audience, and how does your audience find you?
Right. So then, my two biggest audiences are I also teach online piano lessons. So I'm a live streamer with piano lessons. And then some of those people, I mean, this stuff leaks into my,
Mhm.
my teaching and stuff. And so I'll, when I'm talking about muscle memory and, make some offhand comment about, well, it's not really muscle memory, but it,
Yeah.
whatever. And take my 60 seconds after that. And then they find interest in that. So my personality and interest leak into this stuff. I also have another, so my parents ran a cult that I was a part of for about 40 years. All right. Technically, I call it almost a cult because the word cult is poorly defined and frequently overused. And also, I just don't like thinking of myself as a victim. I still love my parents and brother, even though it's been years since any of them have been willing to talk. It's only in quick overviews like this that I'm willing to use the word cult as a shorthand because if you'd been there, you would call it a cult, which I know because virtually everyone who used to be involved there now calls it a cult. For more information, visit almostacult.com. Sorry to make it dark. I just also wanted to be clear. And so part of my audience is I wrote about the organization after I left. And so there's a big following of that. So it's like religious and, well, it's religious because I was a pastor and that it's like cult-ish because of this thing over
Sure,
here.
sure, sure.
It's
So you have
musical.
network. You have network.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, right. And so I try not to mix them because if you want to take piano lessons, you might not want to hear about a cult. You might not want your 10-year-old kid to hear all the stories. So I try to keep them all very separate. But the name of the podcast is If I'm Really Honest. And it's just a place where I'm talking to people who say things that go against the consensus of their tribe
Mhm.
because they feel compelled to, because they've noticed something that
Mhm.
they
Mhm.
can't convince themselves to not see anymore.
Right.
And so, and your book seems, to
Well, at the
fit
time,
well
that
with
was the case. I mean, for sure, when that book came out in 50 years soon,
yeah.
yeah, it was very much going against, the flow. I mean, it was certainly it at that time it was. I mean, that now it's the mainstream, so to speak. So
Right.
it's a different scenario. But yeah, at the time, it was very much like that.
I don't really have a grid for what the consensus was about the brain or the hippocampus at the time that you dropped your book into that
Right. There
pool.
was no consensus, actually. There was wild kind of disagreement, and for the following reason. Already from the late 1950s, certainly the early 1960s, the hippocampus was connected to memory because of the patient HM.
Okay, you need to know HM because HM is to neuroscience what Adam and Eve is to Christianity or Gregor Mendel's P plants are to genetics. Like, it's nowhere near the whole story, but it's such a foundational tale that everyone in the field is just going to assume that you know it because it's common knowledge. To put it briefly, in 1953, a guy had both of his hippocampuses, known as hippocampi, removed in order to hopefully get rid of his epileptic seizures. After the surgery, he functioned normally in almost every way except that he couldn't form memories. He could hold a piece of information in his brain as long as he was actively repeating it over and over, but as soon as his attention got diverted, he forgot they even had the conversation. But it got weirder in a lot of ways. Perhaps most notably, when he was repeatedly tested on, for example, difficult tracing skills, he improved over time even though he couldn't recall ever having taken the test before. So apparently there was an ability to learn a procedure even though there wasn't an ability to retain the memory of having learned it. This led many people to obviously believe that the brain treats factual information and events differently than it does procedures or skills. Apparently, to the brain, a what is categorically different than a how. Now, in medical writing, of course, they don't use people's full names to protect their identities, so they usually just use initials. So HM was Henry Molaison. Molaison? Honestly, I don't know. I've never said his name out loud because everyone just knows him as HM. And I feel terribly guilty about how much I'm leaving out, but the show must go on.
So
Right.
there was this, prior to HM, the hippocampus was connected to emotion or, just because of its connectivity with other parts of the so-called limbic system. The assumption was it was somehow involved with what the limbic system was thought to be involved with. All of this is wrong, by the way, but
Right.
that's what was thought at the time, that there was such a system, and it was about emotion, and the hippocampus was a part of it, as was the amygdala, as was a few other structures, all of which connected to the hypothalamus. That was
Yeah.
the key. All right. So there was no reigning theory. Then came HM. right? And now, oh, hippocampus has got to do with memory, right?
Right.
Bingo, right? And,
Can, can, let me ask a clarifying question. It seems like the whole species loves to overgeneralize. I would assume that once HM comes along, there would be an overcorrection and say, oh, the hippocampus is memory. All memory leads to the
well,
hippocampus.
at the time when those claims were being made, most people thought about memory as a unitary thing. There was just
Right.
memory, right? And it happened in a certain part of the brain, and other parts of the brain did other things. And
Right.
memory was this sort of separate function, and the hippocampus was critically important in that.
Okay.
Already, however, with HM, and this is what, one of the things that made Brenda Milner famous, her and Sue Corkin. Do you know the name Sue Corkin?
No, I don't.
She wrote a book about HM, which, yeah, I recommend to you if you want to really understand HM better. So they were already showing that, you know what? Contrary to what people believed, HM could actually show some learning in memory, in motor system learning, right? So even then it was clear, well, hold on. So the hippocampus isn't important for all kinds of memory. There's at
Right.
least this, and this other stuff wasn't called memory, right? Like his improvement in mirror drawing and things like that. The
Right.
HM showed improvement on those things, even though he had no idea why. He said, I've never seen this before, but he got better and better at it from day to day,
Right.
right? So at that time, it was called motor learning, right? There was memory, which is what humans do, when they think about
Mhm.
yesterday, and then there's motor learning, right? But already in the 60s, it was pretty clear that, well, it can't only be, there isn't only one kind of memory. So, so along comes HM, and oh wow, it's memory, but maybe not all kinds of memory, although that wasn't emphasized so much at the time, right?
Yeah.
And then people, including Brenda Milner and others, tried to develop an animal model of this memory loss that HM suffered from, right?
Okay.
So they made what they thought were comparable damage in experimental animals,
Right.
monkeys, rats, rabbits, no sign of a memory deficit, anything like what existed in HM.
Right.
So the field in the 1960s, when I was a graduate student, the field was basically just in chaos because there was this rock solid finding in humans. It's got to do
Right.
with memory. And then there's this, all the other animals tested, it doesn't seem to be that important for memory. Now, what was missed, of course, was they weren't talking about the same kind of memory. The
Right.
animal studies were not focused on the kind of memory it said it was. So there were problems, but so the field was in chaos essentially. Didn't and some people were saying, well, maybe the hippocampus in humans is doing something different than it's doing in all other animals.
Okay.
That's kind of a hard story to tell if you believe in evolution. It doesn't make much sense. So and then along comes O'Keefe with the place cell discovery,
Right.
right? And that opened up the door to this other idea, right? That the
Yeah.
hippocampus was involved in spatial memory, a certain kind of memory, not all kinds of memory, not all kinds
Right.
of spatial knowledge, but just this rather specific cognitive mapping relational kind of space. We have other kinds of spatial knowledge, right? This is to the right of me, that's to the left of me. We mean a lot of things we know
Right.
about space that don't involve the hippocampus because space is so important in life.
Right.
But so that's the place cell discovery opened up the door to thinking about it as in a way that might bring the notion of memory together with the notion of space. That in
Yeah.
animals it seemed to be about space, in humans it seemed to be about memory. So why not think about Venn diagram, the intersect between those two? The intersect between space and memory is episodic memory because it
Right.
necessarily involves space. So
Right.
that's
Is
how we
is
got to it. But at the time when the book came out, the field was, well, the book came out already. The theory had, I mean, we published stuff already in '74, kind of forecasting what was coming. So
right.
people were waiting for the book. It didn't. I mean, it was already making an impact. But it really fell at a time when the field was in chaos, and
Yeah.
it really helped to clarify and sharpen our understanding of what the system could be. I mean, we
Right.
got some things right and we got some things wrong, but it changed the trajectory of research on the hippocampus, so that
Yeah.
it sort of that And it really became much more trying to figure out why is the same system involved in episodic memory and spatial mapping. Well, what's the overlap, between them? And then what about these sequences once you talk about episodes? And then now in the last 15 to 20 years, it's more about, okay, let's all agree that the hippocampus is this sequence forming cognitive mapping like apparatus. How does that contribute to all the other things the brain does, right?
Right.
To decision making and to all that other stuff. How does it, the hippocampus doesn't exist on its own. It doesn't, it's right smack in the middle. It doesn't talk to the world. It simply influences how you behave in the world. So how does all that work? So that's kind of where the field has gotten to, basically. But for a long time it was chaotic, and now it's got more focus, but it's broadened out, to be. And at the same time, the kind of classic boundaries in psychology between things like perception, memory, decision making. As I said, back in the 60s, people thought, here's a box that does memory, here's a box that does perception.
Right.
Now we know that's just wrong. I mean, there is no sharp dividing line between those things. And probably every system is involved in memory from start to finish. There are forms of plasticity. Not every system is involved in episodic memory, of course, but we've gone over that already. So the field has changed. The big meta theory about the brain and the organization of the brain is that it isn't just broken up into, here's the hippocampus that does memory, here's the visual cortex that does perception, here's the amygdala that does emotion. No, I mean it's much more integrated than that, and that allows us to think better about the ways in which this structure can be both a memory system and a spatial mapping system and contribute to decision making, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been bigger changes, in meta theories about brain organization, of which the hippocampal story is a part.
Yeah. So improve this analogy for me, because the interplay between the brain regions for me is like, it's really frustrating. I'd rather have this does this thing, this does this thing, but it seems like they all are so integral. For me, it feels like, well, my right hand is the one that is specialized for the things that happen on the right side of my body. And if I have something that happens on the right, my right hand's going to take care of it 90% of the time. But if it's busy, my left hand can also come in and do an almost as good job at that thing. But this one is, we would say my right hand is specialized for this, but this other thing can take over. What is a better analogy than that?
There isn't one, unfortunately. And this is a really thorny issue about, what does it mean to say that one part of the brain can substitute for another, right?
Right.
Your left hand is substituting for your right hand, but you got it right when you said it can do it, but it can't do it quite the same way or as well. So I think that's the analogy you want to carry over into the brain. While it is the case that the hippocampus is critical for doing X, some other structure can accomplish, X prime close to X, but in a different way, right? Probably not the same way. So on the other hand, I got another kind of the piece of history. Up until 1990, just about everything we knew about human brains came from people with brain damage, like your friend, like HM. That was all we had to go with, or post-mortem work, right?
Right.
And because of that, those kinds of studies done on those kinds of people necessarily lead you to say, oh, this person's got a hole in the brain and here and can't do the following things. Therefore, that part of the brain must have been responsible for doing those things. It was when you get your data from that, strictly from that source, you tend to think about the brain as modules that do specific things.
Right.
It all comes in imaging, right? And with the advent of neuroimaging, it became clear that it's networks, right?
Right.
However, we don't want to go whole hog and say every part of the brain is involved in everything you do. That's just crazy, right? So there's this sort of awkward balance between it's sort of semi-modularity, you might say. I mean, there are clearly parts of the brain that are specialized to do certain things, but they do them in concert with other parts of the brain in ways that influence how they do it. And I tend to say, look, say the hippocampus is wired up in a certain way. Look at the internal wiring of it. It's got a certain computational structure, given the way it's wired. Right. David Marr understood that like 60 years ago, right? You know the name David Marr?
I don't.
Look it up.
I will soon. Marr?
Marr, David Marr. He's dead now. You can't interview him, but he was a genius. He was a genius who made major contributions to thinking about hippocampus, cortex, cerebellum, and then visual cortex. A lot of his work came along on the visual cortex. If you look at the wiring diagram of the visual cortex, it's quite different. If you look at the wiring diagram of the amygdala, it's quite different. So the kinds of things that those machines, if you think about it from that, the kinds of computations they can make, hence the kinds of behaviors they can support, will differ as a function. So there is some sort of modularity, and it comes from the different sort of wiring diagrams and the different computational capacities. And from that point of view, it's easier to understand why one part of the brain can't substitute for another, because the wiring diagram is different. It can approximate it in certain ways, but it can't be the same because it doesn't have the same wiring diagram. It doesn't have the same connectivity structure internally. It can't, it cannot. So when people make the claim that, and you probably have run across this, that, memories are first stored in the hippocampus.
Right.
And then over time, they end up in the cortex. Right?
Yes.
And some people think exactly the same memory with exactly the same characteristics, with exactly the same properties and capabilities is over here in the cortex. Right. That's wrong. That's wrong.
Right. So that makes me think that there is legitimacy to the therapeutic idea that if you can move your traumatic memories into long-term memory, they'll have a lesser impact on you, because perhaps it's not literally the exact same memory. It's not as immediate.
Yeah, I mean, you've put together a whole bunch of things. I've written about this, so maybe you've read about the stuff I've done on this.
A little bit, yeah.
The idea there is that traumatic memories are formed at a time when the high stress level that you're under inactivates the hippocampus. We know that hippocampus here's a fact about the hippocampus that most people don't pay much attention to. It's loaded with stress receptors. It's got maybe the highest. So what the hell are all these stress receptors doing in a part of the brain that's only about memory?
Right.
Actually, it made people think about emotion again. But the point is, when you're in a traumatic situation, that level of stress has probably shut off the hippocampus. So now whatever memory you're forming is going to be a memory that is not attached to the context in which that event happened, right? So the notion there is that later on in life, if you get a reminder about that traumatic event, it's not attached to any particular context, the memory. It's so that it's as if it's happening right now. These are the flashbacks that happen when people describe these things. They don't say, like, I remembered, being afraid. They say, it felt like I was there, right? Yes. It's reliving that experience in a very direct way. So the therapeutic idea that led to, that I proposed with somebody back in '85, was that if you can take that memory, that traumatic memory that is a fragment, free-floating fragment, that basically can cause all kinds of havoc, if you can take it in a therapeutic setting, attach it to a context. It could even be the therapeutic context. Doesn't matter. Just anchor it in some context so that going forward, the next time you think about it, you won't think it's happening right now. It won't be quite as scary as it is.
The most traumatic event in my memory happened in a car about 5 years ago. Like Dr. Nadel was saying, for months or years after, dozens of times a day, I didn't remember that event. I relived that event. My life fell apart, and I tried every kind of therapy under the sun to try to get my head to exist in the same dimension as my body, wishing I could carve out the part of my brain that held this memory and other related ones. And then, one day, in one of the therapies, instead of trying to forget, I tried to remember in as much detail as possible. But instead of watching the movie in first person from the driver's seat, I sat in the back, and I watched Jamin in the front seat just as passively as I watched the other person in the passenger seat. And suddenly, I saw things about the situation I had never seen before. Things that almost entirely relieved the anguish and mental pressure of the memory. What's crazy is I thought that I had an amazing recollection of the event. I could recall every single detail. I was in an idling 2003 gray Toyota Corolla. It was Wednesday, May 6, 2020. The clock read 7:32 a.m. I can still see it. Every tiny detail was burned in my brain so I could analyze them one at a time and find out what had gone so wrong. But I couldn't see what had gone so terribly wrong until I put that detail-ridden first-person movie in the context of the real world in which it happened. I'm not a psychologist nor a neurologist. I'm just an anecdote, but one that's particularly important to me.
That was the idea behind, trying to therapeutically help trauma patients by connecting, their memories to context, because they were formed without context in the first place, which, by the way, is kind of like what babies are like, because their hippocampi don't develop much until 12 to 24 months. So with all the learning that's going on in babies for the first 12 months is not episodic. It's they're just learning categories. They're learning, all the things that go, all the statistical regularities in the world, but they're not connecting them to context. So if a 10-month-old kid happens to stick his finger in the electric socket, like I think I did, they're not going to remember, the details of that. They're just going to remember getting shocked, basically. They're going to remember the emotional content. The amygdala is working fine, right? But they don't have any context associated with it. So we speculated beyond, saying that some phobias, like people with spider phobias, let's say, you ask them, where did you get this from? I have no idea why I'm afraid of spiders. So we speculated that this is something that, dates back to an event that happened before they had an episodic memory system, which they could connect this fear of spiders. All they have is a fear of spiders. They don't know where it came from. They don't know where, but they've got it. It's a lot harder to get rid of those kinds of memories than it is to get rid of a memory that is, boxed into a context. You can just, for one, you can say, just don't go anywhere. Don't go to places like that. If you're afraid of heights, don't stand on the edge of a mountain. Don't kind of thing. So that's the therapy came out of this idea that if you shut down the hippocampus, you form kind of strange memories that are fragmented in a way that our memories are not typically fragmented. Typically, they're connected to some context. Otherwise, we don't think about them as a memory anymore.
So would that then be why exposure therapy is helpful?
Exactly right. Well, exposure therapy is a little bit different because it wasn't exposure to a new context necessarily. Exposure therapy was an attempt to just try to get people to exist in the face of the threatening thing and to learn that it isn't threatening, right? So most people, if you're afraid of spiders, you're going to avoid them, and you're never going to find out that actually there's nothing to be afraid of, right? This is the classic avoidance behavior problem. When you're afraid of something, you avoid it, so you can't learn if it no longer is something to be afraid of. Exposure therapy tries to get over that gap. It basically forces you to learn that, guess what? Spiders really aren't that, And eventually, Merrill Kent in the Netherlands, who did some beautiful work on curing people with spider phobias, by exposure therapy. But it's not, in that case, it's not attaching a context. It's trying to get people to unlearn, to actually have experience with the thing without the negative consequences, so that they can learn that it's not the dangerous thing that you thought it was.
But if it's an irrational fear without a context, then encountering that thing in a context that is safe seems like that is grounding this fear in a new experience.
It is partly doing that, although the people who started doing that didn't talk about it that way. The question then becomes, okay, what happens if I see a spider in a different context? The question then is, does this exposure therapy and cure generalize, outside the lab, because now you've anchored it to this context. Okay, spiders are safe here, but what about out there in the garage, right? And again, if you're in Australia, where they've got huntsman spiders, that could kill you, basically.
I think everyone should be afraid of that. There's probably something wrong in your brain if you're not afraid of those.
Anyway, this is fun. You're obviously an interesting guy doing some interesting stuff. All right.
Thank you so much.
All right, Jamin. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for joining me. This is usually the part of the show where I tell you to go like and subscribe my guest's work. But alas, today's guest was seemingly here just out of altruism and a sincere desire to spread curiosity. So instead, perhaps you can just take a moment and appreciate that some of the greatest minds on the planet are freely available for you to appreciate and benefit from. And then there are people like me, who, by a mix of narcissism and poor life decisions, are desperate for you to like and subscribe in order to convince the algorithm that I'm as valuable as my dad says I'm not. And for all of you superfans who carry my flag of not carrying flags, there's a link in the description for free ways you can broaden the reach of this anti-team team known as Team Possibly Wrong. You guys are the best. Be well in every way. I'm rooting for you.